Alright, so let us begin. Today's lesson is going to be about folds. It's a long-awaited one that everyone voted for, so everyone is looking forward to this lesson. And it's very, very easy because the rules have not changed. The rules of the three-dimensional world do not change. They do not shift. They never suddenly change the way light acts as a trajectory from its source, the way light works in rays instead of an emanating, like miasma or a fog. It's not a fog. Light is rays, a series of really, really close to each other rays of photons. I think it's photons, right? I don't know. I'm beside myself today. I don't know. I hear myself when I talk too much nowadays. It's weird because then you just question the words you're choosing. I don't know if you guys know what I mean. Anyways, um, the way objects fall towards gravity, the way they cascade, nothing changes. Everything is the same. The only thing that is confusing about fabric is that most of us have experienced fabric in a drawing in one way, which is lines. We've drawn them as lines. And what that means is, that means that we have only been experiencing the form of fabrics by outlining them. So let's take a look at this photo. This photo is very special to my heart. I don't know why. I just love the way the light, you have like so many rules of physics and light behavior visible in this photograph. It's just like the perfect teaching tool for me. It really caught my eye. It was like an image or post or something, some like weight loss thing. But let's talk about it real quick. Can anyone point out some of the rules of light that we can see visible here? Can anyone point out some of these rules that we list? I just destroyed my secret identity. Oh, I haven't welcomed you guys. Let us welcome everyone. Come on, list. Okay, let's see what it does. Like, why? Welcome Isma, Black Eye, Boom, Brian, Chocolate, Sitterhelm, Crowbit, Default Ace, Flow, Hey, Iken, Japan, Leo, Mr. Ken, Outdoors Dude, Pipachu, Rayon, Roma, Saul, Sarah Chris, Shippuden, Sketch Gomez, Town Mushroom, Z Hazuki, and the others who I cannot scroll down to. I think that's it. I think no one's coming in yet. It's still early. I don't know if there are some in the list that I skipped because it doesn't show. I'm very sorry. Welcome to you too. Um, you guys can't hear me? Okay, let's just wait. Let's see what's happening. Yes, there is a class going on. Brian. Yeah, refresh please. Alright, so because you guys are having trouble, I'm just going to lay out down the rules. First and most important rule is the core shadow rule. The fact that everything's core shadow is respective in its size to the object casting it. So if we've got a large mountain, we've got a large cast shadow. Large mountain, large cast shadow responding to it. The core shadow is usually on the side of the object according to the z-axis, and the separation between like the z-axis placement and where the 90-degree angle happens really on the object. So usually where we find, especially in gradual objects that are spherical or cylindrical, we don't really see much of the right angle. But objects that have a cube-like underlying geometry, we see the 90-degree angle. But let's just take a look at this cylindrical object. Let's just pretend that this is a cross-section of the folds. So we've got the core shadow, and we've got the core shadow stretching across. So that's rule number one, the core shadows. Very, very important rule. Always find your core shadows. This is stuff that happens when your brush is largest. Large brush. And usually, fabrics and everything happens on large brush level. Another rule is the diffuse, the stuff that diffuses the core shadow. So we have core shadow, and then we have the light that reflects back through the core shadow, through the object on which the core shadow is sitting. So this underlying fabric, so this light is reflecting onto this, bouncing off, diffusing the shadow, making it much lighter than it is over here where there is a lot less reflection. There is diffuse over here. There is no diffuse over here. Not enough light really in the way. You've got the cast shadow and the core shadow are separated from each other though. So let's list them as if they were assets. Let's list them as asset components. All right. So core shadow, cast shadow. Whoa, forgot my numbers. Core shadow, cast shadow, and the diffuse light source color. Of course, you've got the light source that happens before the diffuse. So let's put light source or the highlights and midtones. Let's not make it too many. And then we've got the diffuse. All right, these are the things you need to have as a list, as a checklist. So you've got little check boxes beside it, and you would have to check through every single one to make sure that you've considered these signifiers of form, these form signifiers, these landmarks of form, these footprints of form, these fingerprints of form in your drawing of anything, but specifically fabric today. What does all of this mean? What does naming all of this, identifying all of these little tiny mini phenomenons of light mean? It means that you will work in an order when you create the light, when you create the fabric drawing, you will work in a proper order. You will render in the order that is reflective of how things really happen in the real world. So the light comes out first. If you think about it as an order, then the core shadow comes back second, and then the third thing that happens is the cast shadow. The cast shadow can be left for later. It is not completely necessary. Some of you only draw the core shadow. Some of you only draw the cast shadow. Rarely do we see a perfect combination between both, and the only way that you can combine both cast shadow and core shadow and read it in your reference is if you know what they are. So let's identify where cast shadows happen and where core shadows happen. Core shadows and cast shadows are essentially the same thing. They're shadows, but they happen in different ways on an object. Here is where the object stops going down. So let's draw some grid lines. Right here's some more grid line. This is very tricky to draw grid lines. Smaller bump, larger bump. The larger the bump, the larger the shadow. Large hill casts large shadow. Okay. Smaller bump, smaller shadow. Smaller bump, smaller shadow. So if we map it out, the core shadows only exist on the other side of the elevation. So we've got the mountain, the bump, and then this is the core shadow extending only until the end, until it stops being an elevation. The point of elevation, when that ends, that's the ending point is the end point of the core shadow. Cast shadow is this tricky little thing. Let's get another color. Cast shadow is this. If there was enough fog, we would see the cast shadow as something like this. That's why I'm saying they're separate pieces. The cast shadow and the core shadow are not the same thing. The cast shadow is the part of the object that really does stand in the way of the light. Fuck, what did I do? And really get in the way of the ray of the light. So it really proves that light is a real straight line. It's a real ray. Meaning after this line, there was enough light hanging around. So we do see light and we do see objects, but before this line, over here, that's where the cast shadow existed, and it leaves its mark just along here. So this is the cast shadow right here. So this is cast shadow. This right here, remember it's separate. So this is not this. So we have to find where this ends, which is the core shadow. So let's label the core shadow in this bump here, and then bring in the cast shadow in this bump. So you see how important it is to differentiate between both, because different cast shadows come at different times in the painting process. You don't paint them at the same time. You paint them at different intervals. You have to consider them at different intervals, because it's not going to help you if you don't think about it technically. If you don't think about it as something that it has to be first understood on its physical level, on its real world level, and then you have to kind of reflect the order that it happens in the painting. So it's really very helpful for you guys to differentiate between The kinds of shadows. It's one thing when you have an amazing artist come in and you see the way they study and the way they're so particular with their shadows. They have a specific kind of name for every shadow, and then you see the artist that wonders why they're not improving because the only shadow they know is just shadow. They give the word shadow for to summarize every shadow in the image. That's not good. That's not a good order. That's not a good way to think. That's not a good way to approach your drawing. You have to be, the more particular you are with your detail, with the way you label the images in your painting, with what you label the physics, the more it's going to show in your work. It's really going to make a difference. So Jesse J. Jones asks me, Istebrak, why are you so mean and condescending when giving critiques? I think it's very easy to say, ouch, that hurt, when we try to work out. I think it's the same reason why people, when they work out, they avoid really the tough stuff. And they say, well, I don't work out, I don't really need it. Or they come up with different excuses. Oh, I don't really need critiques. It's because you're avoiding the pain of the critique development and really getting better, like a measurable better, like actually getting the measuring tape and seeing that you've lost 2 inches that week. That's real work, and that is not easy, and that's not hard. And you probably are the kind of person that also confuses a training coach for being condescending and mean. You probably confuse football coaches for being condescending and mean. You probably confuse everyone who has some sort of authority level over you in the fact that they understand knowledge and are really providing you with something that might change who you are, might change your skill as condescending and mean. You probably confuse those people for being mean. You know what they're really doing for you? They're helping you. So if it's too much for you, if actually you don't want to see a difference a week from now, a month from now, a year from now, you want to be the same artist, you want to be the same weight, you want to be you don't want to see like comparing the metaphor to weight loss or getting fit. If you don't want to see a difference in your life, in your art, don't come here. Go somewhere else, because I promise results. I'm result driven. I'm not here to adhere to your sensitivities. I really don't give a shit. So that's my response to that. I'm condescending and mean because you don't have any other term for someone who is result driven. I'm bossy, I'm mean, I'm rude, I tell it like it is, I rip you a new asshole. That's the stuff that I've been hearing about myself lately. And you know what? I'm quite proud of it because it means I'm really making a difference on what I'm saying. So get out of here. See you later. And if you want to make a difference in your work, stay here. I invite you to stay. Anyways, back to this. Cast shadow, core shadow. Let's not confuse these from each other. Let's not confuse these different units, because we're going to paint something together. Now let's talk about the line. Moving on, everyone in the chat. Move on. Change of subject. Let's now talk about lines. So lines, whoa, not yellow, not going to work. Orange, let's go darker. Lines, all right? The bane of your existence, the bane of your sketches, the bane of your artistic development, or the crutch, or the very forte of your artistic career. But for me, it's the bane of my development. It was the bane of my development because it was very, very hard for me to make the shift and move away from flat images that made no sense to images that really did make sense. Everyone focus, okay? I'm going to start asking you guys questions that I want you to repeat to me. So when it comes to lines, when we want to start a drawing of some fabric, we want to throw in some lines. So let's say we were copying this image. Let's break this image down into lines. If you were drawing a line drawing of this photograph and you wanted to start it off as a line and then make it realistic, this is pretty much where you place the lines. One most important part of the lines is, remember, use as little lines as possible because you're just going to replace the lines. You're not going to ever use them. Everyone write that back to me. What is going to happen to lines? What happens to lines when we want to switch to realism? Everyone please answer that question for me. So I'm using a little line as possible, and this is where I place these lines. One beautiful line across the entire image. This is the edge line. Now, no duh, but this edge line represents a lot. It means it's the point at which the background starts and the object is encased within it. So this is where your paint for your object, this object here, object A, is enclosed. The paint for this is enclosed in this. This line is very, very important for the form because it needs to stay sharp. So this line will turn into a sharp edge. This line will become a sharp edge. Good. The lines disappear. They get painted over. They removed. They are nothing. They're something, but they are not important for the end result. They are just a blueprint. Lines are blueprints. Lines don't exist in the real world. Only edges exist. So lines on the edge stay sharp. Everyone write that back to me. Try to repeat what I say as much as possible. It's basically me tricking you guys into writing notes, at least just to remember what I say. So lines stay sharp because they represent a sharp edge. The sharp edge means at one point, if you get a microscope and you look at the very tiny atomic or molecular particle edge or whatever of the fabric, at one point it stopped dividing. There were no more, not dividing, but the cells, or not the cells, god damn it, the particles of this fabric stopped. There was no more after. The count stopped, and that's where the background is now visible. Meaning there is no more matter past this point. This means your brush has to stay sharp. You have to erase past this line. That's the power of your edge. And it's very important to have an edge in your drawing, not to leave it to the paint of when you start realistically painting. That's not good to leave it to there. Please establish your line. Where do we put a guideline next? Put the guidelines, and this is a really smart way to use lines. Everyone repeat this once I'm done saying it. Please put your guidelines on the highest point of the fabric bulge or bend or peak that you're going to draw. That's where you should be placing your fabric. Sometimes we do this. Sometimes we place our fabric like this. So we draw like a piece of fabric, and then we do something like this, where we are outlining the beginning and the end of that bulge. So we're really outlining the bulge. Instead of doing that, do this. What does doing this mean? It means it gives you a chance, so it's very easy to see. See, I'm so ingrained to think that I can outline. It's very easy to see this as the bulge, and this is where it goes down, right? No, I want you to see this instead. Because what this will do for you is it will tell you where the peak is. If there is a light source coming in, that's where you throw in that shadow, and that's how you replace that line. You replace that line with that shadow. Next, you respond to that by throwing in the highlight, shadow, and the line becomes replaced. Now this is a high contrast. I'm doing this just for demonstrating where the shadows go and where the lights go. Please do not use this level of darks and lights in your image. Alright, so where I place these lines is where you should be placing your lines in your line art, or a line sketch level of your drawing. If you are using a reference, if you are drawing from your mind, you most likely will do the original form of fabric, which is just encasing it. So this is the high point here, which we didn't draw, and we just drew the beginning and the end of that bulge. So if we drew a grid line, it would look like this. Alright? So that's kind of what I want you guys to think about. When you use lines, use them as guidelines, use them as blueprints to tell you where really the edge really happened. Because look, using a line like this very effectively is going to promise that you are never going to forget about the core shadow and the cast shadow. So using this method, let's do some fabric together. Let's draw some fabric. Let me choose a really good brush for this. Not that you need to depend on your brushes, but you should be thinking about the texture level, how much texture you're really providing. So let's start with a line stage. I usually do not ever start with a really dark black. I usually just use a gray. So I'm using this drawing here, and I'm just throwing in some lines. Remember, the outline edge is what's really important. And I'm drawing it as if I started this off in line art. So I'm not working with a reference right now, so I'm not determining the high point. And let me just try to see if I can organize it a little better. Not impressed. Let me do one very similar to the one we just did. Right, so I'm going to throw a line here. I'm going to throw a line here, and the lines that I'm throwing in right now, I'm basically outlining the shadow. Right. Under this layer, I'm going to lay down my base tone. So there's my base tone. 100%, right? Yeah. Okay. So now, next up is the most, really the most important thing. You will not have a cast shadow or a core shadow or highlights without a what? Can anyone finish this question? This statement? What do you need in order to have all of that? Very easy question. Light source, yay! Beautiful. A light source. When we determine the light source, what are we really deciding on? Actually, why am I doing it all the way to the edge? What are we deciding on when we're throwing in a light source? I'm giving you a hint right now. Ooh. The base tone. Our cast and core shadows, highlights. Yeah, but what does that mean? We're deciding on our palette. Our palette becomes, we can't decide on our palette unless we have a good light source system. We also need to choose the color. So what color is this? Look at the range. It's a pretty dark range. Do I want it to be a little bit lighter? Probably do. I want it to be just a little bit lighter so we can have some serious reflection. Okay, and let's jump in. What's next? What does our list tell us to do next? Okay, so core shadows. Let's do that first. Let's find what our light source is. Light source is going to come down this way. Let's get our core shadows in there. I'm going to use my shadow color, but not fully. I'm also going to lock the screen. I'm not merging the lines just yet. And I'm going to throw these shades in really coarsely. It does not have to be perfect. And only the core shadows. I'm not thinking about cast shadows just yet. You see it ends at the bulge. I'm not thinking about the core shadows just yet. Right there. Cast shadows. I'm thinking about the core shadows. I'm not thinking about the cast shadows. Sorry. And the bulge, the peak of that bulge, so this is why it's so important to have the peak line, gets thinner. So I have to really edge out the core shadow here and make sure that it is small enough to fit into that tiny area. Soon you'll see at the perfect time when to get rid of your lines, and it'll be very obvious. And this gets wider, the range gets wider, so this gets fuzzier because the peak gets less sharp. The peak here is more sharp than it is over here. Here it's much wider, so this means the gradient has a wider range. So more curved edges get wider gradients. Write that back at me. Curved edges get wider gradients. Really important for fabric as well, because fabric, it's so gradual. It's like the king of graduation. Like it just, everything is gradual. Everything it does is gradual because it's fabric, and it can do that because it's very thin substance and almost reflective, is not reflective, translucent. So it'll probably take its time before it reaches the next shade, and every tiny little micro, like square inch that it moves, it's suddenly gotten a new shade, and it's a very gradual thing. I don't know how best to describe it other than that way. Right, so let's find where these other gradual peaks happen and where they get sharper. Probably get sharper here, less blending on the sharper the peak. Write this back at me as well. The sharper the peak, the less blended it is. Okay. And I'm keeping it dark only, so I'm not using my entire amount of my palette. I'm using some of it. And I'm going to go in now with a lessened opacity. And I'm going to throw in even less. You got to be so delicate with fabric. And I'm going to make it slightly darker because the sharper, write this back at me, the sharper the shadow, the sharper the peak, the darker the shadow. Because there's less light coming through because it's a almost 90 degree peak. So this is what I mean. Let me just take a moment. This is a smaller peak, yeah, but it's got a sharper peak. It's got a sharper frequency. Lambda is sharper. I think, no, lambda is, I don't know. And then you've got the wide section, the wide peak, and it's got like an area you can actually stand on. So it's not really a 90-degree angle here. It's not at all. But when you look at the sharper peak, it's not a 90-degree angle either, but it's much closer to a 90-degree angle. That's why the point of sharpness happens so soon. Where here, it's like it happens gradually, and then it becomes dark. Because this is the darkest part, the deepest part of the depression, right over here. But over here, it starts off so early because the peak is so small. And like the way this only happens when you compare them one beside the other, sharing the same light source. So the situation has to share the same light source. Sharper the peak, the darker the shadow. Good, perfect. Let's continue. We haven't even brought in any highlights, and look at the amount of form we already have. No highlights yet. So this, compared to this is much wider. So this means that I'm going to get my soft brush, and I'm going to create even a wider gradient on this bulge right here, because it's just not a sharp bulge altogether. It's a very curved bulge. So this is why I say form studies are pretty easy. They're just like form studies. I mean, fabric studies. They're just like form studies, but like you're drawing extended cylinders. This is much more peaked than this. This is wide, and this is less wide, but it's not as thin as that. So it's going to have a less of a range. So we're blending, but we're not over blending like we did here. We still need to see that edge. I'm gonna go back to my brush. I hate the soft brush. I hate that banding that it does. And I'm just going to clean up. Not thinking about cast shadows at all just yet. So who here is guilty? Who here in the audience is guilty of drawing cast shadows too early? Alright. So this line here, this line here, this line here, and this line here all represent an edge. I'm going to get rid of them in a second. Let me look at my list first. Highlights, yeah, I'm going to need to get rid of them because the highlights are next. So I'm going to go here, lock the layer, and choose the color that is most adjacent. Color that is most adjacent here. Actually, I need to fix this area first, because this is a cast shadow area, so I'm going to leave that line for now, because it's a cast shadow area. I haven't touched on cast shadows just yet. So cast shadows are next. Maybe I should do highlights first. No, cast shadows. Alright, so what's next? Highlight. Let's choose our highlight, because our cast shadow really can't be expressed without the use of a highlight just yet. I forgot this edge right here. Whoops. Sorry, I'm really undecisive. My process is very much like this. I'm going to throw in the edge as well. So I'm getting rid of the line where I'm done with it. Choosing the color and then moving it down just so that it takes that new color. Okay, so I'm done with the edge. The edge is nice and clean. Let's not merge it yet. I'm gonna start throwing in some cast shadows. So cast shadows are very, very tricky when it comes to these bends, because it's really a matter of determining when the object, how close the folds are to each other. So over here we can throw a cast shadow. Just like this. Cast off this object. Let me zoom out to get a better gesture line. And the cast shadow gets less sharp the further away we move. So I'm going to throw it like that. Get my eraser brush. And feather out the shadow the further away it moves from the object. So cast shadows, the rule of cast shadows goes as such. The closer it is to the object casting it, the sharper it will be. I'm going to get my smudge tool, and I'm just going to blur this cast shadow the further it gets. So over here in this image, what happens is the cast shadows are pretty close to each other because she's got a really, really bright light source. Look at the exposure level. But you do see a comparatively much fuzzier shadow when it moves further away from the other. This is a really pixelated image. Maybe if I zoom out to the proper level. Much fuzzier shadow when the object moves away. So this bulge here comes up closer than this bulge. And this bulge right here, if you could take a look, is much fuzzier than this. So we've got sharp, sharp, fuzzy, sharp, because they get closer to each other. They make this kind of bend where here it's close, and here it's far. It's a very small margin. Over here the core shadow is very, very fuzzy because of it's a small bulge relative to every other bulge. But every other cast shadow here is pretty sharp. So it's hard really to tell where that rule really happens in that reference image. But take that rule and just chisel it into stone. That's exactly what it does. Highlights. And then after the highlights, I'm going to add in now after the cast shadows, I'm going to add in the highlights. So now I'm going to bring it in. And wherever we have a cast shadow that was sharp, we have highlights that were bright. Alright, so everyone write that back at me as well. I know a lot of rules, I know, but it's really what makes the difference here, organizing our method. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to change the line color in a second, but the sharper the cast shadow was, the more brightness we have. Because that makes sense. It means that there is closer light casting stronger cast shadows. Alright, so I just need to see the gradients. Really the hardest thing about fabrics, in my opinion, are the gradients that they're expected of us. It's just so much blending. I'm going to go back to my line layer and just make this line disappear again. I don't need it. Have a nice clean line. So light, valley, core shadow, cast shadow, and then light again. We need to have another band of light because it means that the valley has ended and it's gone back up into a peak. I'm going to fix these lights in a second. I don't have time to clean up perfectly. So with the Pearl technique that I've taught a long time ago to you guys, I don't have time to teach it again. But basically what we're doing is the more color we bring in, the smaller our brush gets because we want to create a peak, the feeling of a peak. Gonna get my soft brush. This is on a new layer. I'm really being very, very careful with my gradients. You guys can use one layer. For the sake of the demonstration, I do have to use more layers than I usually do. And remember this cast shadow, it's getting fuzzier and fuzzier, so the more light we bring in, the more fuzzy we have to be. So this beautiful, look at that relationship, beautiful cast shadow happening, and then we're going to clean up this core shadow where that line used to be. So see how confusing your lines are? At the very end, you can let go of your lines entirely. You can start the image without lines. You don't always need the lines to tell you what to do. At the end, there's just too much physics going on, and we haven't even done reflected light yet. And the lines are just, you can get rid of them really early. Alright? How these rules work with black on a way, way smaller range. They just do not work with black. The black material is usually has a very small margin for reflective light, has a small margin for core shadow, and has a small margin for cast shadow, almost non-existent cast shadow, because it's so black you're not going to see the point where the cast shadow started and where it ended, and then you're not going to see much of highlights either unless the black is like nylon or not nylon, spandex or suede and has a lower level of reflectivity in it, like oily leather or something. It has a very small margin. Alright, so I'm going to do this next cast shadow. I'm going to do it on a new layer just to save some more time because we're running out of time. And so this here, what this line was telling me here, all it was saying that there was a cast shadow in between this bulge and this bulge, and some of this cast shadow has, you know what, I'm going to very well stretch it, has stretched over onto the next edge, just like this. Okay? So it means this is darker. I'm going to duplicate the layer. I want it to be even darker. This is darker, and it's got a cast shadow because this is less than that. So we're talking mountain, smaller mountain, cast shadow on half the mountain, mountain's core shadow. So we've got only this tiny sliver of highlight, which is this tiny sliver of highlight. Because this is higher and an altitude, on a measurement, like lengthwise, height-wise, this is taller. This one's taller than this one. A, B, B. The cast shadow casts off this one, leaks over onto the next bulge. Okay? And these are the same rules used for everything. Everything follows these rules. If you remember these rules, you can render anything. You can read any reference. Alright, so what happens is, when we have these two peaks, and we've got this cast shadow, this at one point before the cast shadow happened was a highlight. Because the light traveled here and hovered here. Light traveled here and hovered here because light travels in straight lines. And then we had the shadow, the core shadow on half this one. This is why I never painted this strip right here until later. So what happens is this is darker than this. This peak, this little valley is darker than where the cast shadow starts on the object's outline. That's the only time where outlines really help you. They just tell you where things started and where things ended. And it's a very, very subtle edge. And remember, a lot of this is not blending as well, knowing when not to blend. Not just when to blend, but when not to. Alright? So everyone write that back at me as well. So I'm kind of being really cautious. And because it gets what becomes a wider valley, it gets less darks to it. So this is another gradient to add to the list. Gets much wider. Alright, so there's that. Let me correct this really fast, because I don't have time to paint over it. And now let's make this shadow sharper as it's supposed to be. So this shadow here, I'm going to up my opacity of my eraser way up, and then sharpen this shadow. Sometimes darkening isn't necessary. All you have to do is sharpen the shadow a little bit, and it will get darker. It'll feel darker because of the contrast. But of course, it gets fuzzier the further away it moves. So we've got to do that. Let's lower our opacity a little bit. My opacity is always jumping up and down. You're never going to have a set opacity that you're working with. It's just there's too many gradients to consider. More highlights over here, like more sharp or more of a peak and less of a peak. I'm going to zoom out and make sure the light is traveling on an appropriate exposure line. So over here we would have less. This is a very boring fabric. You always use references. This is just for the sake of the demonstration. And I need to make the peak now for the highlight on the last bulge, so we haven't done that yet. So again, the smaller my brush gets, the more paint I give. And look at what I just did. I diffused this shadow because this light is bouncing back, diffusing this shadow. So now we're getting into the secondary light source, into diffusing secondary light sources. Alright, so it's looking more and more like a fabric because we're taking it slowly. Alright, what's next? Diffuse. So this is a core shadow right here. I'm going to make it a little stronger. And then merge down, completely getting rid of the lines. Let me just get rid of the lines. The lines have reached their expiration date. It's over for the lines. They are no longer useful. Alright. I'm going to leave that one because I haven't rendered it. It's okay. So what I'm going to do now is, after darkening this half here, another layer. After you use lots of layers, just merge. You know, you can't use them all the time. You gotta merge after a little bit. You gotta choose where it gets darkest on this image, because in a second I'm gonna bring in the diffuse light and diffuse this entire area. So this little piece of fabric reflected on this side here and made this little bit lighter. And I'm going to erase away again what I don't want. This is really my process. I lay down a color and then I erase away what I don't want of it. Now look at that, instantly the texture changed into something that has a specular range, meaning something that's reflective. So now it looks like silk, or like a frame and like silk billowing in the wind or something. This range right here is a little bit off. I need to correct it. And then it gets wider. I'm just going to use my smudge tool. This is what I use with my hand, so it's pretty much equivalent to my traditional process. I smudge a lot with my hand. And then back to 100% opacity for eraser, and we're doing everything that is visible in this image right here. We're repeating the rules. That's all we're doing, and we're getting a read. That's kind of what I mean when how important it is to remember these rules as not just the rules of physics, but the rules that we use when we paint. That's the order that we're supposed to work in. I'm going to duplicate the layer because of fuzzy edges. Merge that down. Get rid of this line. 100%. Okay, and then throw in some light on this side, just traveling off the peak. My eye is always on my navigator. I always want to make sure I zoom out somehow. This is a very, very boring situation, remember. And then I'm going to get this core shadow right here. Let me just actually let me just erase that outer edge of that fabric. 100%. Let's pretend it looks something like this. And you see what I mean when I say it's a form study? It's a form study. It's the same rules. The same rules have been applied. Just got to make it a perfect little curve, because everything is curvy on the perfect amount, and they're the most delicate little gradients, and honestly these fabrics are such fuss pots. I guess that's okay. And then I'm going to go back to locking the layers opacity. It's really helpful to do that. I recommend you get into the habit of locking the opacity, because then you're just going to be cleaning up all day. Reestablishing that core shadow, getting the darkness range, going darker. You see I haven't used the intense, complete amounts of the dark everywhere. I've only used them where they get brighter, so I've responded to high points with brightness. This bit still doesn't really work for me. I need to fix that. Carry the core shadow in between. So we've differentiated between different kinds of shadows. I don't have time for critiques today, I'm unfortunately sorry guys, it's just a lesson. We've made a list of, like a bucket list of things to do with those things that we've identified. That's what it is. The more organized you are, the more of a read you'll get over time. And now I really want to, like, let's say it's like silk. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to increase the highlight, just working with what I've chosen already. And only in the lightest spot we use the lightest bit. And we're just following that line. So the light travels brightest across this range, so that's where I'm laying down those highlights. And this is nowhere near the level of this, because this is hiding all the way over here. And then clean up. This is excessive rendering, but it's kind of what it's like. This is like the real grit of it all. This is what really happens when we draw. So this whole entire side here is exposed to the light, so I'm going to do a little bit of correcting and zooming out. Done the major stuff. This side here gets a little bit more highlights. Less intense though, because the light's coming on an angle. This little bit, this little coarse shadow, I might make it sharper just for effect, because I really like sharp shadows. Because now that I'm zoomed out, I could really see the potential of like the benefit of a sharper shadow. Everything is so gradual and kind of seems empty in this area. I need to introduce some detail. So a nice sharp shadow might do this area some good. And see, I broke a rule, but it's okay because it's reading. This area here is reflecting light on this area. So they're both going to be diffused. And then the coarse shadow, the entire coarse shadow range is just diffused as well. And just like that, we have a nice coarse shadow. I just want it to be a little sharper. It's a bit too bulgy, too bulgy, too soft. Just like this. I'm getting some color. It's very, very tricky and tedious getting the perfect line and the perfect gradual tone, and it's just a pain in the dick. Sorry. My voice broke when I said that. I'm sorry, I'm going through puberty. It's just not, I'm not saying it yet. Maybe it's the edge. It's probably the edge. Let me get my eraser on 100%. And just, see, this is a very light fabric. This could be like a yellow or like a, like an orange or a pink or something. And with the edge work, this is where it's really important to start cleaning up. This is where the finale happens with the texture. The sharper it is, the less fuzzy it is, right? So that means that it's going to either be the difference between silk or flannel. Flannel is such a funny word. So this is where we decide if it's fuzzy. Is it a fuzzy fabric? Is it a sharp fabric? And the more gradients that it has, the less microtexture it has. I'm going to zoom back one more time. And I'm going to start with a darkened layer, just diffusing some more coarse shadows. Because remember, the coarse shadow, write this back to me. This is a very important technique. Yeah, we laid down the coarse shadow when we laid down the highlights, but when we get into the diffused level, when we get to the secondary light source step, we are no longer, we have to make every coarse shadow, everything gets lighter when we get into the step of secondary light source. Everything gets lighter. What the fuck? I put it on lighten, man. Everything gets lighter. So I'm using my lighten level, my lighten layer brush mode, and I'm just lightening all the coarse shadows one step up, because that's what happens. Everything gets lightened one more. Yeah, we made it dark. That's because we had to take that step before we got to that step. And then we have some more. This reflects onto this, so we've got like a sliver of secondary light source happening right across the side of this. Look at that baby. I don't know, I might move it somewhere else, because that's not the brightest spot, but it'll still work. You see how desperate I am to keep it clean? Like, it's such a pain in the ass to keep all of this clean. Just total cancellation. Yeah. I'll extend it. I'm not going to be a lazy douchebag. I'm just going to extend it, lower my opacity, shrink my brush, and just push that secondary light source up. And this is the brightest spot, so this is where we're going to get a little bit of extra highlighting, but we're still going to have to clean it because this is a generally dark area. So it's not just about how dark we go as well, it's about the range. That made no sense. You'll see in a second. Damn it. Damn it. That's just this is me when I draw. And then I'm just gonna bring this all down because that is a core shadow area and it's a cast shadow area and I cannot fuck around there. There are rules there that I cannot break. It means it has to stay dark. Go back to darken. Fix that. Sharpen. Whoa, no. And this area here, you see this fuzz? We got to get rid of this fuzz because that's a really bright spot. So this is an edge that we've got to clean. We can't mess around with this edge. This is where a cast shadow becomes sharp. This is where a highlight becomes bright. Same thing over here. We got to make that. Nope. See, I brought in a new shade. Never bring in new shades. Don't be a boob like me and bring in a new shade when zoomed in. If you want to bring in a new shade, zoom out. That's the only way you can do it. Because you're not going to be able to gauge whether or not it's too much or too little. Zoomed in, it's hard to tell. So all of these rules we have used, and the line is history. The line is, it's in the past. We're using efficient fuel now. We're no longer using whatever people used back then for gasoline. Take a look at that. That's a lot of form right there. Okay? So this bend here, I'm kind of still trying to figure it out. Just design. This is where really you get creative. Design-wise, I'm kind of just thinking about it. The peaks here are much deeper than the peaks here, but they're also much closer to each other here. So I'm thinking at one point there was just no light at all, and I could just throw in one of these, but you see, you have to be very careful. Much less opacity, but larger brush. Maybe just to add in, no, it's not working, it has to start. You just have to choose a side. It's just not going to work, yeah. And then I'm going to get my dark. See, I haven't used all of it, have I? No. Because I want to be able to use it at my disposal when I need it. If you use all your darks early on, the ones that you chose for yourself, you're really not setting yourself up for success at that point. And if that sounded condescending, you can... you know where the door is. This is success that we're trying to find here. We're not trying to find nannies. We're not trying to find cookie cutter classes here. We're trying to really make a difference in the way people study and what they draw. and results don't come easy, and no pain, no gain, so deal with it. Ass rape happens. And we're... I play too much League. I think that's the problem. Lighten. I just completely fucked this up, didn't I? Darken. Darken and lighten layers are awesome because once you use one, you're not really touching any other tones other than the dark tones. Look at this horrible, look at this banding. Okay, filter, noise, add noise. I think that might help a little. If you add noise, it helps with the banding. This peak here, this here is a sharper peak than here. So it means this area is going to be a much sharper gradient. And you probably have... I think this was the problem. Everything was too measured. You probably have a... still undarkened. slanted cast shadow over here. Can't believe you guys are still here. Aren't you guys bored of me right now? And then I'm gonna blend this, losing my voice. And I'm just gonna get lighten again and diffuse this whole mono right here. That person who messaged me on Skype. I'm so sorry. Alright. So that's what we learned today with all of this. There's just so many little bouncy lights coming out of everything. It's hard to keep track, right? How do we keep track? How do we come to a point where we're doing the keeping track thing? Make a list. Lists are awesome. They're good for shopping, they're good for doing chores, and they're good for drawing. You want to quote me? Quote me on that. Lists are awesome. So some reflected light on that. I think we just need one massive ass reflected light on this edge right here. I just feel like we might need that. Because this whole thing here is one big band. But again, it has to be very, very fuzzy the further away you move. So lots of caretaking and lots of, what's that word? Supervising. You have to supervise every single choice you make, of course, because you're the artist. But it really is like, you know, working with a clipboard and making sure that, you know, you met every thing on the clipboard, every little. We have a clash here between two light sources. Like every little thing on the list that you've made. Excuse me. Check it off. I'm just gonna, because I use so much soft brush, I'm just going to use a sharpen layer on that. Go back to darken and fix this. Probably gonna have a big meal because this was very tiring. That tends to happen to me. When I draw, I get really tired. Okay. But that's everything that we saw in this image. We just duplicated. This is just more interesting because it's the real world. You know, I've used my brain's processing power versus the real world, so mine looks way more boring and way less realistic. But it is moving and working from a realistic image and the influence of a realistic image. So everything that we have here was visible and observable and listable over here. Core shadow, cast shadow, highlights, high contrast, closer to the object, less contrast, further from the object, fuzzier shadows, sharp, fuzzy, sharp. All of that stuff is what we're doing, and it's not perfect cylinders in this image. It's not boring like it is here. There's just cylinders that we're drawing here. I'm sorry I couldn't critique you guys' work today. That's usually how it is with theme weeks. We have the lesson and then we have the class. I want to see work like this. Where is it? Like this. This is beautiful. This is amazing. You got your lines, but you replaced them very well. It just looks like a very well done image. Be careful. Make sure that you're seeing what you're supposed to be seeing. You know when you're looking at a cast shadow and when you're looking at a core shadow. I feel like over here you've kind of just gone from light, dark, light, dark, light, dark pattern-wise. So be careful not to copy blindly. But I love this process. I want to see this kind of process for homework. Lines, and then the core shadows, and then the details on top that interrupt the core shadows. Large to small, please. And that's it. I'll look at these next time. So with this image, the contrast is just too low. I might do something like that just to make it pop a little bit. Image adjustments, because I have no time to really fix contrast and work with really light, because that takes more blending, because you're increasing your range. I might just up the contrast just a little bit, like this. So does anyone else have anything, any questions, anything to add to today's lesson? I'm just going to do a little trick over here. Kind of just lighten the edge, the lower bit, because that's not like a fog, but it's just like a little thing that happens when the further away you move from the focal point, you get less detail. And on this, I just want to see more reflected light. Any questions? I have a really fast question. What should I be doing to get better at perspective? I'm really having trouble with it. Sorry if this question has nothing to do with the lesson. It's okay, it's just a Q&A session. To get better with perspective, it's really all mathematics. It's doing enough perspective images so that you memorize the process perfectly. And that's really what it is. There's no creativity pinch of in perspective work. The creativity comes after, when you're choosing the kind of architecture, where you're choosing what it is that you're drawing. The what is the creative, but the how is entirely mathematical. To get better at perspective, you have to realize that you have to use straight lines. You have to use perfect measurements. You have to make sure the distances of either vanishing point for 2-point vanishing, 2-point perspective, you have to make sure that they are of the perfect distance apart. Another way to get really good at perspective is to find vanishing points in real photographs of cities. You're going to have vanishing points in real photographs because it's just squares on a big square, which is the landscape. So you're going to have lots of aligning vanishing points. So find a photograph, like Google image, bird's eye view of not bird's eye, like window, from a window of a city, or like a city scene from a window, or let me see, city view, apartment, and try to find the vanishing point in there. So you can find the vanishing point in this. This is 3-point, because you're looking down. Find the vanishing point in this, and you can just align them with each other. All of this vanishing point leads to a point. I think it's a 1-point perspective. And this also really helps you find vanishing points. Straight lines in landscape should traditionally be just straight ass lines. If they are not straight, you're working with 3-point perspective, where you have curves. And identify the kinds of perspectives that are available to you to learn. So there's 1-point, 2-point, 3-point. Do not go into 4 and 5. You really don't need it. It's very rarely that you're going to use that. Just 1, 2, and 3. So that if you're doing a comic book or something, you're probably going to want to get into learning that. High contrast closer to the light source, right? Yes, Black Oreo. Straight ass lines, yeah. What do you have against soft brush? I really want to make a question, but I'm willing to finish. Waiting for you to finish so I don't interrupt. Okay, I answered yours. This lists are awesome. I think we need one massive ass list. I think we need one massive ass. I'm expecting a dragon to explode through a fabric any second now. Ista, under brush settings, decrease the brush spacing. It'll also help with the banding. Thank you, Draken. I'm just going to write that over here. I'm going to take care of banding. Thank you, Draken. I really appreciate that. Sorry, guys. I'm just going through the comments just to see Ista be shading in more ways than one. As rape happens. Any questions I missed? Any comments? How does this work with fabric that is opaque? The one I drew was opaque. How does this work with fabric that is transparent? Well, you got digital power, so you can just change opacity or just erase away if you want something that is transparent. But what I drew today was definitely workable on opaque. If you're drawing a darker, not a light colored fabric, everything is just less range, less lights, more shadows. less reflective. No more reflective unless it's like made of shiny material. No like secondary light source diffusion like I did. So none of this. It has to be white to have this much if it's mattified and not shiny. All is knowing when not to blend. Very, very good job. And I will see you guys on Thursday. Do not forget, it's going to be at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, and this is where I'm going to be critiquing fabric. So I'm going to be referring to this class. If you missed it, please watch it. And have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.